Macroeconomics and geopolitics are hitting head-on as tariffs, sanctions, and trade agreements dominate the headline. Against this backdrop, business leaders and board members are trying to make long-term strategic decisions and considering which opportunities and risks to focus on. This quarter, we invited Ian Bremmer, president and founder of Eurasia Group, to share his views on the current environment and its impact on business. And here are the highlights.
Geopolitics are becoming more important in a macro way, and that's not usually true. I mean, I know I'm a political scientist, and if I'm talking in my book, I should always say the politics really matters. But the reality is that usually political risk is something you pay attention to, both upside and downside, inside countries, particularly emerging markets where the regulatory environment is much less transparent. It can change a lot more with an individual leader. And sometimes in certain regional hotspots where tensions, cross-border migration, failed states flare up. But in this environment, the macro geopolitical is actually becoming very important. And that's because we're entering a geopolitical recession. In other words, you have economic recessions, right? Every 6 to 7 years on average since World War II, we see them, we know what a boom and a bust cycle feels like. Geopolitical recessions don't happen as often. But what a geopolitical recession means is when the entire global order that you're used to operating in, multinational corporations that understand that there's a World Trade Organization and there's Bretton Woods Accord on currency and there are global standards and a global free market that's led by the United States and its allies, that's unwinding. And it's unwinding in part because the U.S. is less interested in playing that role, in part because our allies are less interested in following us and more divided themselves, Brexit, the challenges inside the EU and the rest. But the biggest piece, of course, is the rise of China and the fact that China is almost the world's largest economy. It is an economic superpower. It is a technological superpower, but it doesn't support the U.S.-led order. It's creating its own institutions. It's putting over $1 trillion into building out the Belt and Road Initiative. It's authoritarian and it's state capitalist. Now, all of your clients, all of our clients, they're really interested in a world that has a global free market with one set of standards, with one internet, with, so that they can become global corporations. They want to have access to every client, every customer in the world. Well, we're heading into a world where that won't be true anymore. And that unwind, even in an environment today where the U.S. has just grown at 4.2% in the second quarter, we expect strong growth in 2018 and 2019. Globally, we expect strong growth in 2018, 2019, almost 4% for both years, yet the geopolitical environment is much more tense. That is a challenge for most of the people that are watching or listening to this podcast right now.
So, having you just explained that, what are the odds of the G7 world coming back together then?
Zero.
Zero.
Zero. Now, the G7 world is a world where the United States and our advanced industrial democracy allies control all of the standards. And that world order cannot come back. And it can't come back because such a large part of the global economy just isn't that, right? I mean, if you think about what China and other major emerging markets represent, it's most of the world's people, it's increasingly most of the patents, most of the innovations. It's where so much of the global economy is being generated from, right? If you think about global growth, China's responsible for something like 40% of global growth right now. That's a very significant number. And so, that doesn't mean China's not going to replace the United States. We're not going to be living in a world that's suddenly led by China the way it was led by the U.S. after World War II, but it won't be an American-dominated space. At the very least, it'll be fragmented but cooperative. But it might be fragmented and uncooperative. It could be more of a Cold War environment. And I think the big question we have to figure out over the next few years is how much of a role the United States wants to play in actively shaping rules for the rest of the world, having a major seat at that table, or are we going to say, no, this is the way it's going to be for us. You guys decide how it's going to be for you guys, but if you want to play ball in the United States, here are our rules. That's an open question.
And where do you see it going?
I think we honestly don't know. I mean, I'm telling you that this one of the reasons why geopolitics are volatile today is that we understand that, look, there's very low chance of World War III. This is not a military confrontation between the Americans and the Chinese. They're only a regional power, militarily speaking. The U.S. today spends more than the next 11 countries combined on our defense budget. It's going to be decades before there's a serious military threat to the U.S. that has real economic clout behind it. The Russians, their economy is the size of Canada today, even a little smaller than that. It's very different from the Soviet days. But if I look at technology, for example, I do believe that we are heading to two competing digital spaces, one American and one Chinese. And the Europeans probably will have to pick, and they'll probably pick the United States. And other emerging markets will have to pick too, and many of them will pick China because there'll be so much money coming from the Chinese to align them, particularly those in Southeast Asia or in sub-Saharan Africa. And what that means if you're a corporation is that suddenly you thought you were working in one global market with the same standards, suddenly you're working in very different markets with very different standards. For a global partnership like KPMG, that's really important because it means you're decentralizing your leadership, and your China firm has to look even more different from your U.S. firm than it does right now, with different leadership, different ownership structure, sort of different alignment with the government, different types of standards, different data regulations, all of these sorts of things.
And how do you think populism is going to play into this, with the rise in populism that we've seen in recent years?
Well, it's important to phrase it that way as opposed to, how do you deal with Trump? Because populism is not about Trump. It's so much broader than that. It's been coming for a long time. I mean, if you look at the American political spectrum right here in the United States, and you look at what people that identified as Democrats or Republicans actually believed in, the overlap of those interests 25 years ago was like this. It was very close. It has since then, over the last 2 decades, gone like this, where there's very little overlap. In other words, you now have, it's not just that the Democrats and Republicans in office have gotten more different, it's that the people have gotten more different, their interests have gotten more different, and there's not much political demand for folks in the center right or center left. That's true in Canada. A little less true than the U.S., but it's still true in Canada. That's why you see Ford winning the Ontario premiership, the second most important position in the country, just in the last couple of months. It's happened in the UK with the Brexit vote, of course. It's happened in Italy with their new government, of course, Five-Star Movement and the Northern League, both on the extremes. It's happened in Germany with the weakness of Merkel, and even in France with Macron, who is much weaker than he used to be, and the outside anti-establishment parties on the left, the communists, on the right, the National Front, are much stronger than they were. So there's all of this is going to challenge the idea that free trade and open borders for migration is something that the industrial democracies, the wealthy countries, really support. Increasingly, very large percentages of the populations in these countries don't support those policies, and they will vote for politicians that are willing to implement very different sorts of goals.
So, as a result of that, you think we're going to see some significant impacts on regulation, taxes, or trade barriers?
Well, yes and no. In the United States, what's really interesting is despite the fact that the Americans voted for someone that they thought was going to break the system, he hasn't actually broken the system. He's not even tried. If you think about what Trump has implemented in policy, not his tweets, not his character, not the investigations, but policy, which is what the corporations are particularly interested in, he kind of looks like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio. So regulatory rollback, right? Undoing Obama executive orders, his Fed appointments, for example, appointments to the Federal Reserve Bank, his appointments for the judiciary, certainly his tax reform, all of these things, even immigration policy. If you look at the policies, not what he's saying, his policies, they're very similar to what you would have seen under Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or any traditional establishment Republican. The one exception is the budget, where you see a very significant deficit run up, $1 trillion in deficit, that frankly looks like a Democrat budget than Republican, because Trump just wanted a deal and gave everyone what they wanted. And a lot of the Republicans don't like that. So in the United States, I think that the populism does not play out much in terms of actual policies, which means that in the medium to long term, so many of the workers in the U.S. that got those quick tax break or the Christmas bonuses, when the economy turns down, they're going to get even angrier. And so it will probably lead to more of this behavior. Where in Europe, I do think that you're seeing a shift in the regulatory environment towards supporting more of these kinds of policies. The Italians, for example, now look like they're talking about a fiscal deficit at 2.6%, providing an awful lot of goodies to the Italians that voted these people in. And the Europeans, the Germans, and Brussels are going to have major problems because they want more of a fiscal adjustment. They want austerity. They want budgets to work for the long term. So I do think that in Europe you're probably going to see more impact. And of course, the biggest impact so far is Brexit, which if it wasn't for this anti-establishment sentiment, the UK would still be in the EU. Actually, they're negotiating and soon will have negotiated a very messy exit from the EU, which is going to cost the British economy quite a bit.
Good. What about if we move on and talk a little bit about trade wars? Obviously, there's been a lot of noise lately with the trade wars in China. Where do you see that headed?
So it's pretty clear that the United States feels that the Chinese have engaged in many unfair trade practices that need to stop. And I'm not just saying what Trump thinks. I'm saying broadly the administration, many in Congress. When you go to the American Chamber of Commerce in China and you talk to their corporate members, most of them feel like they have less sustainable businesses in China in the next 5-10 years than they've thought at any point since they've been doing business there. So the Chinese companies are getting stronger. There's no rule of law. There's no independent judiciary. The Chinese government's supporting them. It feels like an increasingly unlevel playing field. So the fact that President Trump has decided to lean into that issue and start throwing tariffs against the Chinese and strengthening CFIUS regulations, limiting Chinese investment into technology, for example, in the U.S., is something that's broadly supported, I think, in the United States, not just by the masses, but also by those that are really funding the campaign. But China's not a small country, and the ability of the Chinese government to hit the Americans back is real, and that is going to start to squeeze. It'll have an impact on the U.S. economy and the markets over time, but it'll also have an impact on all those companies doing business in China. And ultimately, Trump, in the same way that he's been looking to get deals that may not be big deals, but they're incremental improvements that he can put his name on. He's had some success in South Korea, in Argentina, in Brazil, arguably even with the Europeans at this point. He hasn't yet with China. I think he wants that. I don't think he's trying to break the Chinese. I think he wants an incremental set of improvements that he can say, I was the president that got that done. But the important point is, only Trump can do it. Trump has made very clear that he gets along well with Xi Jinping despite all these problems. He wants to sit down with him personally. The next meeting they have one-on-one is in the end of November at the G20 summit in Argentina. And it's very clear that nothing is going to happen in this relationship that could improve the trade war until that meeting. But I do believe that that's going to be the most important summit of Trump's presidency to date, more important than him meeting with Putin in Helsinki, more important than Kim Jong-un in Singapore. I mean, several months after those meetings, what's actually happened? Not that much. The China meeting, really, it's make or break for where the U.S.-China trade relationship is going to go. And on balance, I think both sides are approaching that meeting looking for a deal. I'd be really surprised if at this time next year you and I are talking about a full-blown trade war between the Americans and the Chinese.
So basically, stay tuned till November.
I think that's right. I think that there's going to be more tariffs that will be levied before then, and there will start to be an actual market impact. But I think that we'll start to see us turning the corner at that point. U.S.-China relations will be problematic on other issues, like on the South China Sea. They'll be problematic on issues of technology, and the biggest American tech firms not having access to China, Facebook, Google, Amazon. I mean, they're not there. And, you know, what will be the world's largest economy very soon, that is an ongoing problem. So I don't think U.S.-China relations are heading to be easy. I don't think the breakthrough is going to make us friends, but I do think that this idea of an escalating trade friction that causes a trade war that drives the global economy into recession strikes me as quite unlikely.
If I bring it back closer from a geography perspective to us, what about the U.S. and Canada?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, just in the last couple of days, we've seen that Trump saying that he's not going to meet with Trudeau and he's not getting along very well and the Canadians are being unfair. Look, the Americans have a lot more leverage over Canada than the Americans do with the Chinese, right? I mean, this is a dominant, absolutely dominant economy for them. There are some things the Americans want the Canadians to change. Most importantly, their supply management system for dairy that keeps American dairy out of Canada. And it's very popular in Canada. Trudeau has big elections coming up shortly in Quebec, which is a major dairy producing area. I can't see him doing anything big until after that, right, in early October. Then I think he might actually break. But it's important for him for 2019 too. And, you know, on the one hand, he desperately wants an agreement with the United States. On the other hand, he knows that the ability of Trump to actually break NAFTA is limited. There would be massive lawsuits that would come from corporations and from the attorneys general from all of the states across America that rely on Canadian trade. I mean, about half of American states have Canada as their largest trade partner. And they're not going to just sit quietly if Trump says, let's just do a bilateral deal with Mexico. So I think there's some bluffing going on right now. I think the things that the Americans and the Canadians are demanding from each other aren't actually that far apart. This new NAFTA we're talking about is not really a new NAFTA. It's kind of a tweak. It would be an improvement, by the way, for the Americans. It would be a win, but it wouldn't be a dramatic, oh my God, look what we just accomplished. And ultimately, I think we're more likely to get there than not. But the U.S.-Canada relationship right now is a complication, and Trump doesn't get along with Trudeau.
So once again, October, you think will be, after October will be a key date?
After October will be a key date. You know, there's been just an awful lot of Trump posturing around these trade deals. And again, if you look in his first year, there's been much more accepting of incremental improvement than actual escalation to cause damage. I think that's the relevant point to take away from both of these issues.
Interesting. So if I turn to Asia, tell me, what do you see as a hot spot in Asia?
Well, it's not North Korea. You know, I think actually on North Korea, the big change after Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un in Singapore is that there was suddenly a flurry of diplomacy in the region. Summits with the South Koreans, summits with the Chinese, and a real effort to normalize relations there.
Which is different from what you and I talked about a year ago.
Absolutely. I mean, a year ago, the potential that North Korea was going to blow up geopolitically was real. I thought it was a lot less than many people did in the environment. I had people like Richard Haas at the Council on Foreign Relations telling me it was 50% we were going to get into military conflict with the North Koreans. I thought it was 10. But to be clear, 10 is way too high, right? Because 10% means that South Korea equities are way overvalued. I think today that figure is down lower than 1%, and that's really important. So one of the biggest changes in the geopolitical environment, both in Asia and in the world, has been the fact that after this U.S. meeting with Kim Jong-un, suddenly everyone else says, okay, now we've got the opening to start engaging with this guy. He has suspended his nuclear and ballistic missile tests. He has expressed a willingness to close his ICBM development, which is what was originally Trump's red line. It wasn't denuclearization. It was you can't develop a ballistic missile to hit the United States, continental United States. That is a potential deal. Now, the opponents to Trump will say, you didn't get denuclearization. That's not acceptable. In the same way opponents to Obama said the Iranian deal was no good. But they're going to oppose him no matter what. The fact is, no American president was going to get the North Koreans to get rid of their nukes. But anything that looks like normalization with that country is probably in American interest, especially given the fact that unlike with Iran, where America is the key power that can make or break a deal, with North Korea, we're not the key power. China's the key power because all of the North Korean economy comes from or through China.
So fast forward 1 year. where do you expect North Korea and the U.S. relations to be? Or North Korea with South Korea relations?
I think North Korea-South Korea relations, because the South Korean President Moon has very low popularity and it's gotten low on all of his domestic economic reforms, which have annoyed the businesses. He's reduced the work week and he's increased the minimum wage, not sort of to irritate them, but not enough to make a real difference in the people's lives. He's kind of gotten squeezed by both sides. His only popular policy is North Korea. So he really wants to show that he can normalize relations and start opening economic investment into the North. Now, right now, that would be hard to accomplish because Trump has big sanctions on the North Koreans, as the Americans have for a long time. But Trump, as you've seen, wants a deal. Trump's like, I'm the only guy that could meet with this guy. I want to make something happen. And I think Trump's willingness to accept a longer-term incremental improvement in the relationship that is much lower level than, hey, we don't have a nuclear threat from North Korea anymore, Trump will be willing to move in that direction. And I think in a year's time, you'll have Trump continuing to say, this is a big win for me in the administration. And as a consequence, we'll be getting a little bit more excited about South Korean economic development. That doesn't mean a deal will be signed by the U.S. and North Korea in that period of time. The actual execution of such a deal by people like Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State John Bolton, National Security Advisor, those would take an awful long time to put together.
But we're moving in the right direction.
We're moving in the right direction, yes.
Okay. So if I turn over now to the Middle East, talk to me a little bit about rebalancing of the power there.
Well, I guess I would say America's relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which are extremely strong, and with Israel extremely strong, better than they've been at any point probably in decades, has really changed the way you think about power in the Middle East, right? 5 years ago, there was this effort by Obama to rebalance. The Americans are today the largest oil producer in the world. And if we don't need the Middle East as much, the Obama perspective over time was, well, then why are we betting heavily on one side? Why don't we do what the Chinese do, which is work with everybody? That was part of the logic behind less interest in Saudi Arabia, more interest with Iran. Trump feels differently. Trump feels like actually the Saudis have supported him and his family directly. The Saudis, we don't need their oil, but they have a lot of money. They can buy a lot of American defense. So from a deficit perspective, the Saudis are moving in the right direction. The Iran, for us. And to be fair, the Saudis are doing a lot of reform domestically, so they look different now than they did 5 years ago under Obama. You've got Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, that's letting women drive and changing the military, the religious police no longer have authority on the street. So life for the average young Saudi is changing on the ground, but they've got a long way to go. But the fact is that deal that Obama did on Iran was not a big deal. It was sold as a big deal. The reality was it was just about their nuclear program. We were still very angry with the Iranians on supporting proxy wars against our allies in places like Yemen and Syria. We were angry with Iran for supporting terrorism, terrorist organization Hezbollah, which we consider to be. We were angry with the Iranians for developing ballistic missile capabilities. And they're still doing all of those things. The fact that we have now ended the Iranian deal and done so by ourselves with no support from our allies that were co-signatories of that deal, and that the Iranians really rely on access through American banks and our financial system and our SWIFT system to get that money, means that all those other countries have to stop doing business with Iran. So their economy next year will be in serious recession. It could contract by 10%, and the people are going to get really angry. So there's a real problem there. And the Americans have no intention of backing down. So maybe the Iranians say, okay, uncle, let's see if we can actually agree on some bigger issues that we know are a problem for the U.S. More likely is they restart their uranium enrichment in a bigger way. They start threatening the Saudis on cyber attacks, which they've done in the past. Maybe they have more military threat in Yemen, the Straits of Hormuz, and the potential for military confrontation against Iran is actually higher. So last year, more worried about North Korea. This year, much more worried about Iran.
So you've changed the focus from North Korea, Asia to the Middle East as a concern.
From North Korea to Iran. Asia to the Middle East, I wouldn't say that. Certainly Asia, in terms of the growing strength of one of the biggest changes that's happened in the last year in the world is China's President Xi Jinping has consolidated more power and he's gotten rid of term limits. So he's now president for life. So Xi Jinping's ability as the leader of the Chinese economy to drive strategic change, which is not in American interest and which is incompatible with some of our values and our standards for doing business around the world, that's by far the biggest change in the last year. That makes Asia by far the most relevant place to look at. But if you leave that big, I consider that a big macro structural issue. Once you start getting into the regions and looking at hotspots, then clearly Middle East hotspots are more challenging right now than Asian hotspots.
And from a hotspot perspective, what about Israel?
You know, the fact is that Israel today is one of the most effective and functional democracies in the world. It's secure. They have very little corruption. It's transparent. They have a robust free media. They have a good educational system. Even the Arabs that live in Israel certainly feel that way. There's only one problem, and that's the Palestinians. And if you're Palestinian living in the West Bank, or particularly Gaza, life is horrible for you, and you've been completely walled off from educational development, economic development by the Israelis. And the problem is that since the Palestinians don't represent a threat, they can't actually threaten Israel. They can't get across the border. They can't, throw rockets at the Israelis to threaten them. There's nothing they can really do. And in the region, people don't care. The Saudis, the Emiratis didn't used to talk to the Israelis. Now they do, because they want to cooperate on surveillance and intelligence sharing and the rest. Even the left in Israel doesn't really care about a two-state solution anymore. So the Palestinians are kind of screwed. I mean, it's a little bit like you look at Venezuela, you look at Yemen. There are lots of places where you have significant numbers of people that are living in really failed states that have no opportunity, and not many people really care to change it because it's not creating a crisis. The Palestinians today are in as bad a situation as any time we've seen, certainly in Gaza, in the last 40, 50 years. And yet they're not really providing a threat. And since they're not providing a threat, no one's going to do anything about it.
Okay. So if I turn to Europe, and
Yeah.
you made some comments earlier about Europe already, but what's the outlook for a post-Brexit EU?
Well, I guess I would say that I do believe that we're still heading strongly towards Brexit. The UK is not going to have another referendum that's going to allow them to overturn the decision made by the people, albeit very narrowly, a couple of years ago. But the nature of that Brexit is becoming more uncertain, in part because the Europeans don't care. This is not a high priority. The Europeans are like, okay, you want out? Good, you're out. We have so many things we have to worry about in Europe right now. So this is kind of marginal. They have a fairly unified position. They're not going to give the UK a better deal than they had when they were inside the European Union. It's going to be more challenging. But the Brits are completely uncoordinated on what they want. Theresa May is enormously unpopular. She has big challenges within her own party and disagreements from hardline Brexiters and non. And then also she has big problems with the opposition to her from Labour, the Labour Party, as well as the Northern Ireland, where they haven't been able to come to an agreement on what to do about that situation. And she requires them to continue to govern in Parliament. That's a small party that's part of her coalition. So, but nobody wants her job until she's finished this Brexit, even if it's really ugly, precisely because no one wants to be the person that's leading the UK through this godforsaken process. So what it means is you're going to get a deal, but the deal is only going to accomplish getting the Brits out. It's going to functionally be, it's what they call a blind Brexit, where after the deal you still haven't fundamentally agreed on details of Northern Ireland, or of how you address access to a common EU market, or of migration issues, which means that the level of political uncertainty and volatility for years that will sap the economic strength of the UK, that will erode the position of London as a global financial hub, are going to continue for some time. It's very bad for the British economy.
What about the rest of Europe? How do you see that?
The rest of Europe, I would say, is reasonably stable and reasonably functional. They have these strong European institutions, and nobody else is planning an exit. But European elections, EU Parliament elections come next May are going to be very important because we're now seeing a large number of people supporting parties that actually oppose a strong Europe. They're more interested in national sovereignty, and they're starting to work together. So, for example, the Italians and the Hungarians, their populist movements, both leading their governments right now, have agreed to coordinate in upcoming European parliamentary elections. If we see more of that, then suddenly the European Parliament and the positions that they appoint, running the EC Bank and the European Commission, all of that, will not all be neoliberals who support open borders and free trade. It'll be a fight. And that's something we've never dealt with in Europe before. That's extremely interesting for next year.
Okay. So if I turn out of technology,
yeah,
you know, how do you see that affecting, you know, in your world, industry? What do you think it's going to do, especially between Beijing and Silicon Valley?
Well, I mean, this is, I think, the single biggest open question out there. And I'm afraid that I don't have a great answer for you.
Come on, you always have good answers.
No. I mean, I have a really good question for you that we can't answer and we need to answer. And that is that I am holding, if I think about the United States right now, on the one hand, I firmly believe that companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon are acting as monopolies that increasingly use the consumer as their product, and in many ways that is eroding the fabric of civic nationalism and our liberal democracy. And so we clearly need much better and stronger regulations against those companies for the strength of our own nation. And that would make those companies less profitable and weaker. On the other hand, I firmly believe that there are Chinese companies in this space right now that are being actively supported by the Chinese government to dominate the global technology space in the next 10, 20 years in machine learning and big data and AI. And if the Americans don't have the strongest companies, the others will be, it'll be Chinese. And the global space will be supported by China. So in that way, I feel like in the same way that the Americans back when we were fighting the Soviets, I don't know what you might have thought about Lockheed in the 1970s, but the American government recognized that that company, together with Raytheon, Northrop, and others, were really important for American national security. And so we treated them not as any old company, but as flag-bearing American companies, patriotic, that were going to be national champions for our security. And when I look at the international environment, I think that the U.S. government needs to be supporting companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google as our national champions to be as strong as possible so that we don't cede a global technology future to the Chinese and to a system that, frankly, many of our corporations will not have access to or will have substandard access to. Now, the two things I just said are completely in conflict with each other. That's a real problem. And I do not know how we need to address it. But what I do know is that right now Washington is not addressing it. We don't have enough people with the sophistication on these issues in Senate, in the House, in the White House that can really put those issues on the table, start debating them. We need to debate them now. This cannot wait for 5 or 10 years because we'll be behind if that's the case.
And how do you see, you know, AI and automation? How do you see that impacting the labor market, you know, particularly here in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, it's clear to me when you talk to corporations involved in AI, they say that we're entering a fourth industrial revolution where everything is going to get faster and more efficient and more growth because it's all automated. But if you were to talk about workers that are actually in many of these companies, people that are accountants or bankers, some you know, white collar jobs that are fairly low level and are going to get automated, or drivers, right? Mm-hmm. Which are, you know, by the way, is by far it's the #1 or #2 job in terms of numbers of people in employment in every state in the United States right now. Those jobs, those people don't think this is a fourth industrial revolution. For them, it's a post-industrial revolution. It is a revolution where there's nothing for them. There are no opportunities, and far more jobs will be displaced by AI and automation than were displaced in the United States by globalization and free trade and jobs going to China or Mexico. And I think we need to figure that out quickly. Now, I'm not suggesting that AI won't create lots of new jobs and lots of new sectors. I think the jury is out as to how many new jobs will ultimately be created by these processes, and will it be more or less or even. But what I know is that for the next 10 years, these people that are displaced will not have opportunities because they don't have the training. They don't have the infrastructure. They're not living in the places where these jobs are being made, and they have no ability to move there. And so you're going to get a lot of really angry people. And I don't think it comes all at once. Like right now, consumer confidence in the U.S. is relatively high, interest rates are low, the economy is growing. And that's because corporations, even though every CEO I talk to tells me how they can make more money in the next 10 years with fewer people, they're not going to suddenly get rid of a lot of people because they're doing well. But when we hit a recession, and suddenly, all at once, a whole bunch of American corporations have to take money and have to find money to squeeze their budget, that's when everyone suddenly gets hit. So I think the impact of the next recession on the American worker is going to be dramatically worse than what happened in 2008, even if the scale of the recession from a market perspective is actually not that bad.
That's an interesting way to look at it. I really hadn't thought of it that way. Ian, we've got about 4 minutes left. We're in New York today, and you and I were talking earlier, and I know you've been spending a lot of time at the UN. Why don't you give your thoughts, a couple of minutes of what you're seeing at the UN this week?
Well, this is the one time a year where you got 150 leaders from all over the world that descend on Midtown Manhattan, making it impossible to drive absolutely anywhere. Obviously, President Trump gets most of the attention in the American media because that's by design. It's what he likes, it's what the companies like, the media companies like. Everybody makes money off of it. But the reality is that this is a world with an awful lot of people with pressing domestic agendas and not much international cooperation that's happening. So there are a lot of really useful meetings that are going on, a lot of interesting bilateral deals. There's not a big global agenda. We're not fighting a common theme. Right? It's not like during the Cold War when we all knew that we had an issue with the Soviets and our allies were working with us to say, what are we going to do? Climate change is absolutely a global issue, but it's not top priority for most of the big economies today. The tech stuff we just talked about really isn't on the agenda in a big way. And the economy is doing well. See, I guess what's interesting is this is a UN where there's an awful lot of really important issues, but there's no sense of crisis.
Interesting.
And when you have a global economy that's growing, people are going to think about, okay, what do I need to do? This is a good time to blow out the budget. This is a good time to take care of all of my interests at home. I can push off issues. There's a lot of can kicking that's going on right now. Probably the biggest thing that they're talking about in commonality is something that you already asked me about, which is trade. That there is a general concern that a slip towards a trade war would be bad for everybody. And most people that I've talked to are trying hard to avert that, and I think with some success.
So we've got about 2 minutes now left. If you were giving some advice to boards or management of companies about geopolitical risk and opportunities, what would it be?
It would be, we need to broaden out the potential scenarios that we usually use on these sorts of things. In other words, typically when you're talking about geopolitical risk, with the exception of a couple of small hotspots, if you've got a big emerging market allocation in, let's say, Turkey, and you think it might blow up, so you might have to write it off completely, you'd look at that. But in terms of the global environment, most people think steady state or only incremental change. I think that boards need to start stress testing their businesses against the possibility of a much more fundamental change in the global economy. In other words, the idea that a third of the global economy may be run in a completely different rule set within 5 or 10 years' time is something that boards now have to, any board that has a global organization needs to start doing stress testing for, because it's highly plausible that that's what the world looks like. Still a world where you can make a lot of money, but if you're not prepared for it, it's a world that you suddenly might be closed off from a lot of markets. Much better to plan for that before this happens than when it does.
So do the stress testing today.
Stress testing on broader scenarios that really what you would have considered way outside the box even 3 years ago. Now we're not.
Great.